Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on our webinar this morning. A little brief introduction. My name is Laura Browning, and I'm going to be hosting and moderating the majority of the webinar today. I am the marketing manager at DevFacto Technologies, and we're the creators of Sparrow, which is an exciting new platform for communications professionals that combines an intranet, a mobile app, and in-depth analytics. So for today's webinar, which is entitled Identifying Standards for Internal Communication Measurement, I'm really excited to be sharing our platform today with Sean Williams from True Digital. Without further ado, I would like to hand things over to Sean and let him get this party started.
Thanks, Laura, and hello, everybody. Thanks for taking some time out this morning, this midday, this afternoon, wherever you may be. Really appreciate your taking the time. Before we launch into all of this, a little bit about the image that you see in front of you. The wall that you see that says True Digital Communications on it is now gone from our office because we are a growing full-service digital-first communication and marketing agency based in Cleveland, Ohio, and we have grown so much that we needed more space. So now that wall is gone, and we've got roughly about twice the environment we did before. It's very exciting for us because it only happened probably about a month ago that they finished off the space. So we're excited to do that. And I'm excited to be here with you. Some of you I probably have met in other lives, which means all of my jokes are going to fall incredibly flat with you because you'll already have heard all these routines. But I'm going to persevere and try to make this a fun time for all of us. So just a little bit more about me, and then you already heard a bit from Laura, but I joined True Digital Communications almost a year ago after 8 years running my own consultancy, Communication Ammo. You can tell from this image here that I obviously was not prepared for picture day, but I'm rocking the black t-shirt. I mean, I think the workouts are taking hold here. But the other thing that I would say is I have been 13 years with the Institute for Public Relations Measurement Commission, and I have had the honor for the last several years of running a task force, an international task force on internal communication measurement standards. The whole idea behind that is trying to get to the point where we can say definitively, here's what it is you need to be measuring, and this is how you need to measure it. And I think we've got the what down, as you'll hear this morning, this afternoon, and now we're working in 2018. It's the year of testing, and we'll have a little bit more on that in just a bit. I lead the internal communication and the education practices for True Digital Communications, including management training through the face-to-face communication training program, and then a lot on strategic planning and measurement as a part of that strategic planning effort. So I guess what I'm saying is I've been around a long time and my hair is pretty gray, and that's why you should listen to what I have to say. Laura already briefed you on her, but I've been intrigued, just so you know, there's no compensation agreement here between DevFacto and me. I'm doing this because I care so passionately about the cause of measurement, particularly in internal communications, and I'm grateful to DevFacto for the opportunity to lead this webinar with you. All right, so this is what the plan is for the day. We spent a little bit of time getting to know, having you get to know us. We're going to define measurement. We're going to work through the internal communication measurement standards, and we're going to talk about what happens next. And the path that we will follow will not be as straightforward and direct as a class lecture, because heaven knows those are boring, and the last thing in the world I want to do is bore you. So instead, what we're going to do is I'm going to have a conversation with you, and your part of the conversation takes place in the chat window. And Laura is going to help out in monitoring what it is you have to say there so that we can bring things up and bring them to attention at the time it happens. So feel free, please, to use the chat as liberally as you might if we were sitting around a table having a conversation. All right, so I mean, we all know as internal communication professionals, we know that measurement and evaluation in this space is kind of fraught. And here are 4 reasons why it is we believe that is so. Number one is the perception that it's really expensive. And some of that has been because measurement and evaluation has been broken out separately from the development of internal communication strategy. And when that happens, even though it is intrinsic to the creation of excellent strategic plans and tactical executional plans, there's the perception that it's going to somehow cost a lot of money. We'll hopefully put paid to that idea here. There's also the problem that each of us who have been in the enterprise, and I ran internal communications globally at Goodyear and also at a super regional bank called National City Bank, there's the perception that we're so caught up in the tactical, the stuff that we have to do every day, that we don't have time to focus on the long term. There's the whole metaphor for investing, I guess, that goes into that. You're so worried about quarterly results and getting stuff done that you really don't have time to look more strategically at the longer term sort of outcomes, because we know that a lot of the activities that we undertake in internal communications take some time to bear fruit in terms of impact on the organization. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to that here in just a few minutes. There's also sort of the contribution that we bring, public relations in general, and differentiating those things from the other communication functions in the organization. It's been difficult in the past to try and isolate specific tactics in terms of what their impact is. And what I would say, number one, is there's a problem with that perception, because it isn't very difficult actually to isolate a lot of this stuff. What it is important to keep in mind is that objectives are everything. And so understanding what it is we're trying to accomplish, and I think these measurement standards will help you do that, understanding what we're trying to accomplish is essential to measurement and is essential to specific metrics that you use to measure success. So these are some of the challenges, and I hope we address them here in our conversation today. All right, so now it's time for your first audience participation moment. Please go to the chat box and define for me what your understanding is of the word measurement. What does measurement mean to you? All right, we got a few questions. All right, good. Something that can be managed. Excellent. Thomas Schmidt, you win a little gold star. If I had one, I would give one to you. Yes. Yeah, measuring ROI, that's certainly part of it. We would love to get more deeply into ROI, and we'll talk about that as we go through. Means to determine success of campaigns. Jane, you're absolutely right. Ernesto, I really like your statement in here, being able to identify the impact of our communication. It can be numeric data, Marcin. It just kind of depends on exactly how it is you're measuring. We'll make sure to cover that off. Laura, just make a note to talk about the quantitative versus qualitative assessment, and we can bring that into our discussion. All right, great. This is very good. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to be on the right track here. No worries with what it is that we're going to cover. So the basics of measurement is that there are three different types. I use the term measurement as shorthand. Measurement is one of three sort of means of evaluating or researching what it is you do, and we think of it in this realm. And when I say we, the Measurement Commission kind of goes down this path where research is what you do first. And if you think to some of the very classical models of public relations planning, all of them start with research. We have to understand the universe in which we live. During the time that we're executing on what we're doing, we measure the effectiveness, which gives us input that we can use to be able to adjust our strategies and our tactics as needed. And then once we're done with a campaign, or even we pass a certain period of time, then we evaluate what it is that happens. And what I like to say is that it's not so much that we measure to prove our value, we measure to improve what it is we do. We undertake these three phases in order to make sure that our strategies and our tactics are absolutely as good as they can be. We run into issues all the time in public relations generally, and certainly in internal comms, where we become wedded to what it is we're doing, and we don't adjust. We don't notice that whatever we're doing isn't working as well as we expected, and we need to make a change. And actually, one of the biggest barriers that I've encountered to measuring in my own career has been the perception that we're not going to change what it is we're doing. I've actually had a boss tell me, well, we shouldn't really do any sort of research because we're not going to change what it is we plan to do. And that's just kind of crazy. And this gets to the question of qualitative versus quantitative. Not all measurement, not all research, not all evaluation has to be numerical in nature. Because once again, if the goal is to improve, not necessarily to prove, then a lot of times the qualitative can be just as valuable, in some cases much more valuable. I did my master's thesis as a qualitative study on influence, both online and offline. And certainly the insights that I received from that have helped me to create an offering, shall we say, to the marketplace that is grounded in excellent theory and excellent practice. I don't think I would have gotten that as effectively from a more quantitative sort of approach. So first thing to think about in measurement is that we measure to improve, not to prove. There are several different stages of the measurement and evaluation process, and there are a number of different typologies or schemas or whatever word you want to use to describe them. The ones that we're going to cover right now, outputs, outtakes, outcomes, and organizational impact, are based a lot in the work of Walter Lindemann, who was a legendary PR, both a PR practitioner, senior practitioner in industry, and also a prof and a great researcher. And he fell upon this idea that there are activities, the things that we actually do, and then there are the immediate results of those things, and then how it is that all of that influences some sort of outcome. We've added another step that I'll come to in the coming sections, and that's looking at organizational impact as part of it. And once again, don't get hung up on the terminology here as much as the concept of measuring at each one of these levels. So when we talk about outputs, we talk about what happened as a result of our activity. So it isn't so much the number of internet stories posted that's most important, but it's useful for us to measure that. An example would be at Goodyear, did an evaluation of the stories that were being put on the intranet at the company and discovered that something like 90% of them were North America centric. Well, in a company that was styling itself as an international firm, a global firm, that was a bit of a problem. We weren't learning from each other elsewhere in the enterprise around the world and in 90 different countries. There are great stories to be told that we need to bring forward. So when we discovered the percentage of stories was so heavily weighted in North America, we began a campaign directly to increase the number of stories that we got from outside of the country. And what the impact of that was terrific. There were examples of different people in different geographies learning from each other, not realizing that they had done all this great work. In one case, a press event that occurred in Poland that influenced the communication and marketing team in Turkey to try the same sort of approach with phenomenal results on the bottom line. This would not have happened without us recognizing that we weren't getting those stories onto our intranet and we needed to share them more. And then the other sub-bullets here can tell you the sort of measurement that you might do at this level. ESN is Enterprise Social Network, so we're talking about Yammer, we're talking about Slack, we're talking about any of these, Social Chorus, any of these things where there's a great amount of sharing going on. Sparrow has a similar sort of capability on it as well. We also can look at when we're using email, and email still is used in internal communications quite significantly. We can look at the actual counts of emails sent and the email open rates to see whether it is we're having impact. Very briefly on readability, Angela Sinicus, who many of you may know, and she's one of the reasons why I became a measurement person. Angela, pointed out that we didn't, in our list of standards, we didn't cover a lot of output standards, and that's because we feel like, and our task force felt like, and our Delphi study felt like, that was sort of table stakes, to use the poker term. This was the price of arriving at the table. At the very least, you need to be measuring at the output level, and so because of the differences in different kinds of organizations, it's very difficult to set standards that say that this email open rate is better than others, or that this percentage of enterprise social network activity is somehow better than others. And that's the same case for readability. Within Microsoft Word, you have the Flesch-Kincaid reading numbers, so you can actually get a readability figure out of it. The problem is that works very well in American Standard English and not so well in other languages. So if we're going to create a global standard at the output level, then we have to take that into account. But the main thing that you need to know about outputs is it's what it is we're doing. And so measuring at this level helps to quantify the activities that we're undertaking, and then we can report these things, especially if we look at trends. What's happening in terms of the number of stories we're posting? What's happening in terms of the active users of our enterprise social network? That can be very valuable. Let me just pause there on the outputs and say, once again, head back to the question window and go ahead and put in your answer to how do you think we should measure outputs? What are the things that we should do in order to be effective at measuring outputs? And once again, I'll sing my little song. Quality, views and viewers, very good. And Sophie, you're absolutely right. There's no text. There's a text box. I can see the text box, but I guess you guys can't. Set a baseline and monitor. Thank you, Thomas. That's excellent. Yeah, time spent on a story. We're getting there. Comments, likes, shares. Thank you, Edward. Yes. Surveys, platform analysis. Gail Baxter doing a great job. Yep. Excellent. Know thy audience. Thank you, Mark Tenney. It's good to see your name pop up there. Cool. Okay, so how do we measure them? These are several ways that we can do this. Once again, we're answering the question, what did we do? And trying to see, how do we describe what it is we did? And in external communications, we talk about outputs in two ways. We talk about the actual creation, for example, of a news release, and then we also look at whether a story happened as a consequence of that. We still consider that, and this is somewhat controversial even in measurement circles, we still consider that to be output. We haven't really gone past the basic level, and this is what we're going to suggest to you, is that there's a deeper and more significant way that we can measure that's just beyond the outputs. But this is, in essence, this is how you get some clue as to what it is that's happening in your organization. The second bullet, intranet visitor count. This was essential to my work at Goodyear because we had so few internet users at the beginning that measuring the trend in the number of new users we were getting became an essential way of talking about what impact we conceivably could have in the future. We had to get people on in order to convince the IT department to start automating processes using the intranet, if you can imagine that. Instead of IT coming and saying, we want to take away all your paper, it was IT saying, you can't take away the paper because nobody uses the intranet. So we used news at Goodyear in order to drive the visitor count and convince others in the organization that we actually could make these automation. And there's a lot of onboard metrics, as you see here. With respect to the web, with respect to readability, there are things that are built in to these different systems. And all of those metrics, output metrics, can be very valuable for us, and I don't denigrate them at all. I love the idea of doing output change as a consequence of this. So the next level that we talk about past outputs is outtakes. Outtakes. And this is Katie Payne's definition: whether employees received, paid attention to, comprehended, or retained, particularly messages. So this is the place where we get into message penetration. And in our standards work, we identified 5 outtakes through the course of the work that offered the most promise here. And you can see them in the bullets that you see on the screen. So all of these are related to what's going on inside people's heads. In other words, the immediate result of the activity that we've undertaken. So we've gone ahead and we've improved the number of stories we have from around the country, around the world. What happened inside people's head as a result of that? And once again, one more Goodyear story. We had a daily poll that we used where we talked about the company strategy, which was listed at that time as the 7 reasons to believe in Goodyear. So we tested people's awareness of the 7 reasons. We tested to what extent they felt comfortable and confident in their knowledge about them. We tested their understanding of how it is that those things applied to them. We tested their relevance, and we tested their ability to recall them. And with 7 of them, that was a bit of a challenge. But still, when it comes to outtakes, we're looking at what's going on inside people's heads mainly, as a result of our activity. There are others as well, but in the Delphi study and in the task force and the subsequent discussions with more than 300 people at three different conferences, these were the 5 that really resonated in terms of outtake metrics. And so once again, I need to ask you, from your understanding, how would we do this? And while you're going back to the question window and typing in your ideas about measuring outtakes, Ernesto Izquierdo, sorry for butchering your last name, que lástima, mi español está no muy bien. But yeah, they only reach part of the organization, it's true. But a lot of the reason at Goodyear we were focusing so much on the online group was that these were people who led people throughout the enterprise. And therefore, they were the people who were going to have to stand in the gap between the strategic messaging coming from the C-suite and the headquarters side of things. They were going to have to put that into context for the people who report to them. And so in another analysis that we did, we looked at the extent to which people believed that their leaders, their managers and supervisors were helping them to place that into context. And so that's how it is we began to address that issue. Richard Fournier, ESN, Enterprise Social Network. So things like Slack or Yammer, or well, there's probably another few big ones. That's what ESN means. So good. Focus group surveys, workshops, the qualitative side of things. Yep. Gail Baxter, you and I have to talk, because conversations with a selection of employees is really, really important. All the data you can get from simply having a conversation with someone is really, really great. And then William Groats, pulse surveys administered on a regular basis. Yes, absolutely. There's a great concept that says, we try to boil the ocean sometimes when we do measurement and evaluation, and we really don't need to. We can sample and get every bit as valuable a set of insights as you might imagine. All right, so here are some of the ways that you can measure outtakes. And of course, going directly to the audience and asking is probably the most straightforward. And as I was just saying, you don't have to think that, oh my goodness, we've got 60,000 employees. We can't afford to administer such a large survey. We have many people who are online. We're not going to get to them. It's like, okay, hang on. Let's go ahead and figure out what is it that we would have to do to overcome that issue. If we can't do 60,000, then maybe we can do a sampling of that. Remember, a lot of political polling, despite maybe its recent sort of inaccuracies, which get to some biases that are outside our scope in this discussion, but you can sample your audience, and especially in internal communications, this is an underutilized capability. You also can look to see what it is that people are consuming. One of the greatest things about electronic communication is we have access to these onboard metrics that will tell us those things. We can look at the extent to which they like, they share, they comment, they're actually engaged with the content. Where we get into issues with engagement with the content is we start thinking about it in terms of the entire universe of our population rather than on the sample that we're most concerned about. Back to my point about getting the people who are really going to be responsible for translating strategy into action for people. Maybe those people, the management team, are the ones who need to be most engaged with this sort of content. You also can do a content analysis. You can look at what it is people are saying about it and draw conclusions from it. This can be an incredibly important and interesting exercise. And then we'll come back to this concept again, the observation of people's behavior, and then what other data in the organization might exist out there. We're not to ROI yet, because in our definition, ROI is a financial metric that requires a financial result. But there are many, many non-financial indicators that are really, really important that we can influence, that we can observe, and we have to do that. All right, so Sophie had a question, how do you avoid survey fatigue? You know what, Sophie, survey fatigue, in my experience, means what you're asking me is not relevant to what it is I do. And that's actually one of the biggest arguments against having 100% of your population have to take a survey. Let's focus on the people who are really going to be the most important to the execution of our strategy and focus on them on an ongoing basis, to do the ongoing pulse surveys, as William said, doing focus groups to better understand what the impact of our communication content and activities are. Let's look at that. When people say they have survey fatigue, it's usually because A, they're being asked too many questions, they're being asked for input that doesn't directly relate to what it is they do every day, and B, that there's just C, that there is the perception in life that we are so busy doing the work that trying to step back and get into the whys and the wherefores can be very, very difficult on people. I've seldom heard survey fatigue from organizations that execute really good surveys, that are asking just the questions they need to ask. So fewer lengthy omnibus surveys and more frequent pulse surveys that give you the information that you need quickly and easily. All right, so that leads us to outcomes. So outcomes, once again, as defined through this process of determining, different groups and how it is that they, both in the academic and the practice, how they define the outcome is listed here. So we're looking for going past the baseline awareness and into change and into the concept of how it is attitudes, behaviors, and opinions change over time. And this is where you get the war between persuasion, where you're trying to convince people of something, and enlistment, where you're trying to take them on the journey with you. And there are quite a few of these, and you can see them reflected here. I'll touch on just a couple of these. Advocacy. So in some ways, the definition of advocacy has been translated from the not-for-profit world, where you have someone, or from the legal world, where you have someone who acts as an advocate for you and your interests, and you go beyond that into the idea of an employee who becomes an advocate for the organization on their own. And certainly the creation of brand ambassadors, to coin a phrase, the creation of people who are raving fans is a really important outcome of the communication activity we do. We want people to feel that sense of ownership, the sense of identification, to use the academic term. Another that I'd point out here is the collaboration versus teamwork. In our definitions, these were considered to be two different things. They were related to each other, but teamwork typically exists in an existing team. To what extent do those members of a team pull in the same direction? To use the metaphor of rowing, is everybody rowing? Does everybody have their place? And is everybody doing what it is they need to do to move the team forward? Whereas collaboration is understood to go across different teams, across different silos in the organization. And collaboration is what leads to innovation and to learning. And so these two things are called out as outcomes to be measured. And the rest of these are fairly the same. Discretionary effort comes up very, very frequently in the academic literature. It's the idea that I am so motivated and excited by my job and the organization and its mission and what it is we do, that I'm willing to go beyond the de minimis that I would do every single day. At Goodyear, it was one more tire. Can I go ahead and make one more tire today and have it at the quality level and at the safety level that are required? But am I willing to put forward that additional effort? And measuring each one of these things, you don't have to measure all of them all at once. I mean, that's another misconception. You don't have to have a 150 question survey that's going to go into every one of these dimensions. But what you do have to do is you have to pick the ones that are going to be most relevant for you. And then over time, see which one of these seems to give you the most insight. So now we have the next question. So how do we measure these outcomes? And just to remind you of what they are, we'll put these up here while you drop your questions in, and while I take a sip of this delicious Lake Erie cocktail. Oh, that's ever so much better, and I know you'll feel better about me too when I have my radio voice going. 100%. Yeah, let's see. Laura, what is Gail saying here? Teamwork is a closed system versus collaboration, which is an open system. Is that what she's saying?
Yes, that's
Yeah, I can't open up the chat window enough because then I would wind up putting it onto the screen that you're viewing. So you can even see a little part of it over there. That's not supposed to work.
Yeah, that's the entire question.
Okay, cool. Mark, excellent. Yeah, ask for employee experiences. Stories capture reality. Yeah, that's awesome. And once again, this further double clicks on the point that you don't necessarily have to go quantitative with all of this stuff. You know, you don't have to do formal surveys that ask people about their perception of authenticity of the organization or transparency. But it is helpful to be able to do that. At Goodyear, we did it every 2 years. We did it every 2 years so that we could understand what the impact was of our employee communication system and campaign. Okay, we're moving right along here. So as you said in your questions here, yeah, you do surveys, you do interviews and focus groups. I'm a big fan of interviews. I've done, especially recently, a lot of qualitative projects where we wind up talking to the individual constituents and having a structured interview with them. And they can be, in some ways, even more effective than focus groups for trying to get to that richness of detail of understanding where you are in terms of outcome success. Focus groups, have their own dynamic, and depending on how many people you have, you may have to have as a moderator, you may have to have quite a lot of involvement in trying to help people get the chance to speak up and speak out. We also know that in focus groups, people's behavior tends to condition that of others, and consequently, if you've got people who are naysayers, then they can wind up bringing more negative thinking to the fore. If you've got people who dominate conversations, and that, by the way, that was one of my main developmental goals when I was early in my career, was I had a tendency to dominate in group situations because I was so eager to prove how smart I was. And so I had to learn how to step back and ask more questions and make more suggestions rather than dominate. And we see that in focus groups all the time. Self-administered diaries are awesome. I don't know whether any of you have ever done a blocks of work exercise. This is especially effective when somebody comes to you and says, we need to reduce the head count and try to contract the activities and try to focus on the things that are most effective. You can have people keep diaries of what they actually do. Now that I'm on an agency side of things, we have a timekeeping system that enables us to do that very easily. But self-administered diaries can help people understand. You can choose a group of people and say, we want you to interact for the next week, interact with the materials that we send you by email, by the internet, in print, whatever, and we want you to record what your observations are and then share those with us. And that can be really, really valuable. And once again, you don't have to get to a huge scale to make that effective, because once again, the whole concept is, how can we gather input and data that are going to enable us to be more effective? Mary Jane says, have you used nominal groups? I reveal my lack of terminology knowledge. Do you mean nominal groups as in having a control group that isn't exposed to the new stuff and a test group that is? Is that what you mean by nominal groups, Mary Jane Martin? We'll come back to that. We'll march on and come back to that question. Laura, could you please flag that one for me?
Yeah, you got it.
All right, and so finally we get to organizational impact. So now, since I've talked a lot about Goodyear, it's where the rubber meets the road. Organizational impact is how our communication activity has actually affected organizational performance. And this is where we get closer and closer to the concept of ROI. This is where we get to the point where we're actually describing what impact we're having. And if you think about safety, quality, and productivity, which are the big three certainly in manufacturing, the only one that we didn't put on here was quality, because we think that's included in productivity. We think productivity numbers always are not so much about output per worker hour, but productive output. So you back out of the figures any sort of errors, quality problems that get your product or service pulled out of circulation. We did a version of this at one of the banks I worked at, where you didn't just go by the number of new accounts that opened, you went by the number of new accounts that opened that were still there after 3 months, that didn't have any overdrafts, etc. So quality was baked into that figure. And this turns up in our research. We look at the impact on innovation. I mean, we talked about teamwork and collaboration. Well, teamwork and collaboration are precursors to innovation in our estimation, and this is something we'll test in 2018. Continuous improvement, the Six Sigma model, is extremely important. Everybody is trying to get better and better at what it is they do in organizations so that the workers become more productive, not necessarily so that we can just squeeze more work out of them and make their lives miserable, but instead that we can create a place where they feel inspired and engaged and excited to be there every day so that they tell their friends. Continuous improvement and measuring the continuous improvement of other metrics is pretty important. Reputation figures, when at National City Corporation, which I happened to be there when and handling measurement for them during the financial crisis. And this was one of the measures that the regulators looked at. They didn't look only at the financial metrics. They also looked at what the impact of the financial crisis was having on the reputation of the organization. And so this is something that is becoming an element in enlightened balanced scorecards alongside employee retention. Just as much as we try to have great financial performance for our organization, we also want to hold on to the employees we want to hold on to. And so when we talk about the measuring the impact on employee retention, we say, what is it that gets people to be retained? What is it that happens in our organization that enables people to feel like they're making a difference and to feel like they've joined a purpose-driven organization that matches their values and their objectives for the future, and so they want to stay and be a part of that. And then safety is another thing that is measured in nearly all organizations. Even at different types of companies where you wouldn't think that safety would be a concern, we still looked at incidents at the banks that I worked at. We still looked at whether people were getting safely to and from work, whether people were safe from harm within the buildings in which they worked. This still was extremely important. Now, we will say that when we look backward at the pantheon of outtakes, outcomes, and how they influence organizational impact, it can be difficult to try and isolate which of these things means which, and that's part of, in 2018 and probably the early part of 2019, that's part of what our research project is wanting to test. We want to see the extent to which our 22 standards have influence. So when we look at everything except the 6 in front of you, when we look at the 16 others, what is their relationship to productivity, innovation, continuous improvement, reputation, retention, and safety? That is what we need to test in the coming year. And that is sort of what's going to enable us to put a stake in the ground and say that these standards are what it is that we should do. Barb says, I have also used, and I can't make out the whole thing, Laura, I have also used employee engagement as a measurement of
good internal communications, loosely associated, of course.
Yeah, well, Barb, I think there is a positive association between engagement and the effectiveness of internal comms. The reason why there is no employee engagement metric here is that we chose instead to look at the precursors to engagement. And let me just quickly go back to those. So look at our outcomes here. And how many of these things do you think, and this isn't a quiz or anything, but certainly trust, satisfaction, discretionary effort, empowerment, and advocacy all could be seen as components of what we might call employee engagement. Our thing is, with all of the discussions that we had, we were not able to substantiate academically, we were not able to substantiate that those things do in fact add up to something that we could call engagement. And so rather than make the assumption and go down the road of the Gallup organization and the Cube 12, we just said, look, let's test this theory. Let's measure instead the things that contribute to engagement, so that as we do this measurement, as we do what it is we're doing, we have the opportunity to isolate specific factors that might be more valuable to us. At National City, we did the Gallup engagement survey, and we had tremendous engagement. The problem was we didn't know, in the areas where we were falling short, we didn't know what it is we needed to do and what specifically would influence that engagement number. We didn't understand whether it was a question of authenticity, or whether it was a question of effective communication, or whether it was a question of feeling empowered to do what was right. We just didn't have that insight based on what the overall Gallup data told us. And so you wound up sort of having a difficult time using that data in order to improve what you're doing going forward. All right, so how you measure organizational impact, and many of these things are similar to what we've seen before. Certainly, you're looking at surveys and perceptions, but you're also going to compare those things to different sorts of metrics. There's a fair amount of data out there that talks about network analysis being one of the ways that you can gain a real understanding of how messages are making their way through your organization. So partnering with the IT department and getting access to those tools and being able to evaluate sort of how effective email is or isn't can be very helpful. Influencer communications within the organization, you can discover those things by looking at system metrics. Interestingly, in my own research, I found that there were two different studies that used the same methodology that had diametrically opposed conclusions. One found that there were information nodes, where you could send information to someone and it would make it to orders of magnitude more people because they were passing it along and commenting upon it. And then the other one found that there were information sinks, places where you take that same action because of their connections, and as it would turn out, it would go there to die. So it's kind of a drag to try and understand these things at that level. Let's see, Sophie, read your point about isolating the contribution comms makes. Laura, what's the rest of that one?
Sophie said, regarding your point about isolating the contribution comms makes to say engagement. In large matrix organizations, difficult to measure contribution comms makes as opposed to HR, people, talent, etc. Is this what you're saying, and how do you address this?
Yeah. I think one thing we can learn from, and thanks, that's a really good question, Sophie. One thing we can take from that experience is that in marketing, you have marketing mix modeling. So you've got the statistical model that allows for multiple independent variables that enable us to compare these things and find correlations that we normally wouldn't see otherwise. And that's sort of what we surmise is going to be necessary here, that in the end, there needs to be a statistical model that enables you to put these inputs in to determine what percentage of those things relates to the other. Proof AI, Proof Automation, Mark Stuss's organization is doing this for marketing. And Mark and I met at Katie Payne's Summit on Measurement year before last, and we're connected, but we haven't had the opportunity yet to start talking turkey about how his model might be able to be applied to internal comms. But that's where you have to get eventually. However, I will say that the 4 CEOs that I have worked closely with, and I had occasion, I worked with 4 CEOs, 2 of which were exceptionally close, traveled with one for 2 years quite a lot. And he said, you don't have to convince me that internal communication is important or that each individual tactic that you do is important. I accept that. What I want to know is, if I make investments in employee communication, what can I expect in terms of the outcome metrics and the organizational impact metrics that you're describing? Can we influence retention? Can we make talent attraction more effective? Can we create a great place to work as a consequence of these activities? And that's where we get to this concept that the qualitative can be every bit as helpful as the quantitative. All right, I have just another couple of slides, and yes, you will get the entire deck, and always happy to follow up and have additional conversations with you. But just a couple of other things to touch on before we get to the rest of your questions and answers, and that's, we talk a lot about measuring in the digital world, and so I offer up these sort of thoughts here that, with all of these things, we are insisting that you move past the outputs and outtakes. That you got one story from the metrics that you get off of the systems that you're using, but we want to connect these things to more impactful measures. We want to get into the outcomes, the attitudes and outcomes. We want to get into the impact that we see in the organization. What I would advise is, especially at the beginning, take inventory and measure at each level, and then take a look at goals and objectives and set them. Decide what it is you want to do with respect to increases in audience, for example, or in the engagement with the content. If you have a lot of content that you're creating that isn't being engaged with, then revisit that content and start to say, is this a matter of style or is it a matter of substance? Use these data to set goals and objectives and to evaluate what it is you're doing, and then make changes to what you do. Don't be afraid to say, hey, you know what? The enterprise social network we've been using is simply not having the desired result. One of my clients really doubled down on Yammer. It was built into the system, and several of the sub-teams just had phenomenal results with it, putting together cross-functional teams, increasing the diversity of teams on client engagements, etc. Were really successful sort of metrics. Others just really weren't interested in using the tool for that purpose. And in the end, they said, let's commit to a year to see how many people we can get engaged in the system and see if we can double the number of people who are on it and are using it successfully. And if we can't, then we'll move in another direction. And in the end, that's what they decided to do. So I'm going to skip through the next couple of slides in the interest of getting to your questions. But measurable objectives mean you have to count stuff. So if you think about the SMART objectives, the specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, if you think of those, the SMART objectives, then not every single goal you set will have to go through the SMART, but you're going to have to at least answer the question, what do I need people to think, feel, or do as a result of my communication activities? And so starting with measurable objectives is how you build the foundation for the house. And if you don't have a solid foundation, then it makes no sense at all to try and redecorate the upstairs guest room. Instead, look at this and say, what is it that our objectives are, and what's our path to evaluating them? What are we doing on the output levels? Can we make objectives that are realistic, that are going to get where we have to get? I mean, at Goodyear, we increased by nearly 5-fold the number of people who were active users of our intranet. But that still left a significant number of people who still weren't using the intranet. And it became more and more difficult to have the sizable gains we saw over the course of a couple of years because we were dealing with a shrinking universe of non-adopters. And so we had to think of something different in order to reach those people. And actually, we wound up getting a fair number of them to start being active users as a consequence. But get in there and start making these objectives and count the stuff you can count, and then move on to the stuff that is more effective. So, I call them stupid measurement tricks. Thank you, David Letterman, who coined a version of that. Head for instituteforpr.org, and you can look at the Measurement Commission work. The Measurement Commission, over the course of the past couple of years, has become much more active in blogging on the IPR site. It's extremely important. If you want to review your strategic planning capabilities, if maybe you're new to this concept of having the discipline of it, there is a replay of a webinar that I did last year on the AMO planning model, audience, message, method, objective. Start with your audiences, establish what you want to think, feel, or do, and then choose your message architecture and how it is you're going to communicate. If you weren't completely put off by my craziness, then you can find that there. And then I'll leave this in the deck. The standards are contained in the pages that follow here, and this is why it is we did what we did. We wanted we wanted to determine what to measure and then a series of best practices on how. And we wanted to do that because it gives us a common frame of comparison, and it helps that other parts of our public relations world have developed standards for investor relations measurement and for traditional media. And part of being a profession, which, as you know, we're a practice, not a profession because we don't have professional licensure, but standards are part of creating the profession. And besides, people like you are the ones that said, we're tired of not having really any idea of how it is we need to measure these things. We've got too many sort of thoughts and ideas, and we want to move forward. So, like I said, they're in the deck. You can see them, the outtake standards, the outcome standards. We highlighted here in red the most often mentioned need for a standard, and that's on trust. And then second, were attitude, advocacy, and empowerment as being important. And we already talked about engagement. So, you know, the three standards mentioned most important were advocacy, attitude, and empowerment. And if you think about those things and how they relate to one another, it's very important. So they're all here, and we'll skip that. And I will take a breath and hand things over to Laura to just tell us a little bit about Sparrow before our questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. I feel like this has been a fantastic conversation, so I will do my best to show you as quickly as I can about Sparrow here, and then we'll get back to some of these questions for sure. So just moving forward, in case you haven't heard of Sparrow before, it is a three-piece modern workspace that was created by DevFacto a couple of years ago with the intent of improving communication across your entire organization. So the platform consists of three major areas. The first is an out-of-the-box intranet that's really efficient and cost-effective. The second is a mobile app, which really enables desk employees and non-desk employees to receive personalized organizational news where and when they want it on their mobile device. But the third aspect is what I wanted to highlight today because it ties in really nicely to Sean's measurement, is the analytics platform. So Sparrow Analytics actually empower communications teams to measure your performance and support the IC standards and ultimately make strategic decisions based on real data. So what I want to introduce you today is the analytics component and highlight how it can do that for you. So Sparrow Analytics are actually diverse and really in-depth. They make it simple to measure outputs and outtakes and then draw informed conclusions with that data. So by combining these conclusions with the data available elsewhere in your organization, Sparrow actually can help you to draw a detailed understanding of the outcomes, the impact, and the organizational change. So a few examples just to show you here. So Sparrow Analytics does measure outputs. So whether you're posting communications from your intranet or from the Sparrow publishing portal, the platform actually tracks what's important to you and makes it easy to access that information. So a few examples of what Sparrow actually can track for you is author dynamics. It can track who subscribed to particular tags, things like number of posts, most viewed posts, most popular authors, as well as readership statistics. And then there are a number of outtakes that can actually be measured that we recognize the information important to an organization. So although it's not the same across the board, we can personalize the statistics that you're following. So Sparrow can also, and this is actually a really interesting one, Sparrow can also track the outtakes. So that can give you an understanding of whether an employee has actually received, paid attention to, and comprehended particular messages. So specific examples, although not limited to these, actually include things like our in-depth read analysis. So it shows how far in a particular post someone has actually read. So Sparrow can track specific scroll activity on a mobile device and then show where readers have dropped off. So whether they've skimmed, actually skipped a message, or if they've in fact read the entire article. So you can see an example here that'll show what percentage of an article a reader has actually made their way through. We also track awareness scoring, which is a calculated score out of 100 for a particular post or topic. So say safety gloves, for example, if you're tracking that across your organization. And so it's based on the volume and quality of reads over time. So the awareness score will fluctuate, And so it could be an indicator that maybe you need to repost or post differently about safety gloves, for example. So in all, Sparrow makes it easy to measure outputs and outtakes so that you can then correlate with that data from external systems like, say, production, efficiency, or safety metrics to inform about actual behaviors and organizational change within your organization. So keep in mind, this is just a brief introduction about Sparrow Analytics. It's a really in-depth platform. We'd love to show you more about it, perhaps through a demo, as well as highlight the other aspects such as the intranet or the mobile app. So I can hear Sean typing away madly on his responses to some of the questions out there. If you do have questions for us about Sparrow, for Sean about the standards, I recognize we're running a little bit short on time here. Please feel free to enter them right into our chat box, and we can address some of those maybe in the last few minutes. But otherwise, in closing, just a reminder that we will share this webinar as well as potentially some of the answers to these questions that get left behind in a follow-up email, and you can expect to receive that in the next 24 hours. Also, you're welcome to just contact Sean or I directly, and we're happy to get back to you that way as well. So for the remainder of our time, Sean, I'm not sure if there's a few of the flight questions perhaps that you want to address on the actual call.
Yeah, there are a couple of them here, and indeed, I did try to like reach back and ask some people. You know, it's always great to really know the platform you're dealing with. So I didn't realize that if I clicked the question, that I get the entire question in a little window underneath there. Well, live and learn. Sneh Kuhreha says, would you say self-administered diaries are best used in pilot situations? If not, how would you use them? And it's like, yeah, I like them in pilots. I mean, once again, in smaller teams, that sort of true qualitative and involved sort of feedback is going to be more effective than trying to scale it up over an entire enterprise. I mean, it would become pretty onerous even with an electronic diary. It would become pretty onerous to analyze that much qualitative data. I had my hands full just doing my thesis work in that area, but I think you can scale these things up team by team, and you can actually do hybrids where you'd have a number of people would keep diaries, and then they could get together and compare notes, and then perhaps input things into a system that would sort of pre-qualify or pre-categorize what it is that they say. I thought that was a good question. Let's see. Yeah, William said, internal comm effective measurement is much more involved than what our external communications PR colleagues apply. You know, do you recommend PR take a similar approach to the internal principles? And I always say, you know, I don't speak ill of my external communications colleagues. I think that they do what it is that they think is right. I think there's a lot that prevents them from drawing a solid, bright line between what their activity is, particularly the stories that they get in mainstream media, and connecting that bright line all the way to organizational impact metrics. But I think they should, and I think there's a significant amount of research that says that PR makes advertising more effective and better, and so that's stuff you absolutely can measure that speaks to impacts beyond merely the outputs. And then the last comment on that one would be, you know, one thing that is not being measured as effectively as it could, something that we do here at True Digital, is we look at what the search metrics tell us. You know, branded search is a great proxy for awareness in the marketplace. And so if you've got a public relations campaign out where you're doing quite a lot of PR, or you've got major placements that exist in the news media, you can look to see, particularly even regionalized, you can look to see what the impact on branded search is, or people reading the story and then trying to find out more about you. You know, even at a small scale, that could be a very effective means of supporting the concept of what you're doing externally as having an effect. Sorry, Gail, that probably was me. I forgot to mute myself when I was typing some answers in here.
We're really excited to add some answers, so it's good.
And then I know we're past time, but Mary Jane's Mary Jane's question, how do you know when the employee stops reading? I think that one's for you, Laura.
Yeah, I've responded in the text box here, but in a nutshell, we're obviously happy to do any demos or discuss some of these features a little bit further, but Sparrow in the actual mobile app can track how quickly someone scrolls through an article as well as how far they've gone through that article. So because it's on a mobile device, it can actually see where someone exited from and whether they scroll through at a pace that would be just, a reading pace versus a really quick scroll or versus just going into an article and popping back out. So it gives really detailed information that way. All right, so it looks like we have a lot of thank yous. People probably have to jump off the line. So I guess thank you to everyone who has joined us today. I hope you all had as much fun as Sean and I did. We'll definitely be following up with an email as well as answering any questions that we missed here. I know there's a few, so we'll be sure to get in touch. And thanks again, Sean, for joining us. This was super informative, and it was really fun to have you aboard. So thank you.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you, everybody, for your time today. We do have an article. My team, Stacy Smith, Michelle Ewing, and Julie O'Neill have a article coming out in PR Journal pretty much any day now. And so we obviously have contact information for you. We'll reach out and send you the link to that when it becomes available.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, everyone. Have a great day.